We've got Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul here watching all of this unfold. Senator, good to see you in the flesh. How are you?
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for having me.
What do you make of all this?
Well, I do think it's important that we try to open the government, and the only way I see a way forward is for a compromise between Speaker Pelosi and the president, and you can't have a whole lot of compromise if she's not in town to have conversations. The last conversation they had, she said she wasn't going to compromise at all, that she was offering zero. And so I really still think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think they could split the difference. The president's asking for $5.7 billion. Nancy Pelosi's offering zero. But she has to be willing to negotiate. If you keep saying zero, you're not willing to negotiate.
She actually upped the ante, right, by saying the wall itself is immoral.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of crazy. She's voted for money for walls many times. Democrats last year in the Senate voted for $25 billion for walls. So I remain one who's for a wall, but not for unlimited funding for walls. So I actually think there should be some compromises on how much is spent, and that we'll have other forms of barriers other than walls in some places, and frankly, maybe electronic or other ways to have surveillance along the border in big swaths of the border.
What did you think of Lindsey Graham's characterization that this is essentially a childish tit for tat?
Well, I do think that it's petty partisanship to try to prevent the president from giving the State of the Union. To my knowledge, it's never, ever happened before. And so I do think that aspect of it's petty.
Is it protocol for the speaker to invite you to speak?
And I think he's already been invited.
Can they disinvite you?
That's a good question. It's never, ever happened before. And what I've suggested is if they're serious about it and they do run the House and they won't let the president come, I think the Senate should offer to have the State of the Union there. And I think that would be a fitting response to this. I think in the end they may back down because I think the public really doesn't want the partisanship to be so empty that they're saying, oh, we're no longer going to have the State of the Union because people don't like, the Democrats don't like the Republicans.
Well, it's not etched into our Constitution that we have it, right? So you don't have to do the address. You could just submit it in writing if you do it at all. But do you think that this has gotten so bad, Senator? Obviously, Lindsey Graham lumped the president in with this sophomoric behavior. Do you?
Well, I would say the president's response at least is regarding negotiation. If you're in town, you negotiate. If you're not in town, she's just sort of absconding without doing any negotiating. And so really, I think that's the way the discussion and debate should be framed. Republicans, I think, are willing to compromise on this. I'm one who would split the difference. Other Republicans have said the same thing. The president hasn't yet said, but there isn't a negotiation because Nancy Pelosi is not willing to negotiate. But I think that's a bad position for her to take because you've got these workers with, that are not being paid, and I think that's not a good situation.
You think he should just declare an emergency and be done with it?
I don't think that's the best way to run government either. Yeah. What I have offered is something called the Shutdown Prevention Act, and what it would do is if we got to a cliff, we got to a date and government funding wasn't taken care of, the government funding would continue, but with a 1% cut. So if you didn't pass your appropriation bills, it'd be 99% funding for 90 days. And 90 days later, if you still hadn't passed your appropriation bills, it would go to 98% funding, 97%, and it would keep going down a percentage point every 90 days. My guess is they would get the appropriation bills done pretty quickly.
Have others expressed interest in that?
There have been. On the Republican side, there's been much talk of this. And
maybe on the Democratic side?
I don't think so, and I think that's why it'd be an interesting vote because Democrats say that they don't want the shutdown, they're blaming the president for it, but what if they're given an opportunity to vote for something that would get rid of shutdowns for the rest of time? We would never have another shutdown, we'd never have another cliff. Half the drama every year in Congress is over shutdowns. I think you could get to a point where there's no shutdown, but there has to be a hammer. You have to actually do something that maybe neither side wants, and that's to reduce spending. Now, I frankly think it's a good idea to reduce spending either way, but I think it would also work to keep the government open.
Senator, in light of what happened in Syria, the killing of 4 Americans and others, in this ISIS-inspired attack, we're told ISIS-inspired, and ISIS-sympathetic groups in 2 regions in Africa over the last 48 hours, do you think the president and the vice president were premature to say that ISIS was destroyed?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, we've taken 99% of ISIS's land and they're basically destroyed. Is there any remnants of radical Islam and the ideology that leads to this terrorism? Sure, it's everywhere. If your argument is that we're going to wait till there's no threat of anyone ever organizing terroristic violence in the Middle East, you'll wait forever. And so, frankly,
by saying that about ISIS, Senator, it almost emboldened them to do this.
No, I think what happens is that there always will be remnants of every movement everywhere. So the same is said for Afghanistan. So I was in a meeting in the White House the other day, and one of the Republican senators said, we don't want to leave Afghanistan precipitously. And I'm like, 17 years is not precipitously. But they keep saying it that way, as if every time we ever consider leaving.
You're still comfortable with the plan to take our...
Absolutely. What was the goal in Syria? Destruction of ISIS. 99% of their land's been taken, 99% destroyed. They're on the run. And here's my point. If you always take care of people, they'll never take care of themselves. The Syrians need to step up. The Turks, everybody else, they live there. Can they not handle 1% of ISIS and finish off the job if it needs to be done?
Well, a lot of your Republican colleagues, and they know your history on this, it would be very leery of foreign entanglements and the like, but Congressman Adam Kinzinger, the Republican representative from Illinois, had wondered aloud whether you are retreating from the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's a bad way to put it. I think the better way is to look at the overall scheme of things. People like that still think the Iraq War was a good idea. The president, myself, and others say, you know what? The Iraq War was a big mistake because it destabilized the Middle East. It allowed Iran to go stronger. Iraq, the country we liberated, is now most closely aligned with Iran.
So when a Steny Hoyer criticizes that move, as he has, the shutdown, Nancy Pelosi, with whom we're going to be here very shortly, Chuck Schumer on the floor of the Senate saying much the same thing, that no matter what the president is doing, no matter what Republicans are considering, it's a disaster. What do you say?
You mean with regard to the shutdown?
All of the above.
I think that people sometimes get lost in partisanship. And so, for example, the Democrats hate everything that is President Trump. And in hating everything that's him, they aren't having reasonable positions on anything. So with Russia...
Is this going to be the next 2 years, Senator?
Maybe. You know, for example, should we talk to Russia? I think Russia is a bad actor in many ways, and yet I would talk to Russia because I think part of the solution to Ukraine's difficulty is talking to Russia.
Even in this environment where now the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is saying there might have been collusion at the lower levels, but not with the president. Are you getting different vibes on that?
Well, absolutely we should talk to Russia because they have nuclear arms. Absolutely we should have talked to Russia 2 or 3 years ago in Syria. 2 or 3 years ago when Assad was on the run, he was losing battles and the country was almost evenly split, I think we could have talked Russia into accepting Assad into exile.
But is any discussion with Russia, Senator, compromised by this latest stuff in the Cuomo interview with Rudy Giuliani, which he seemed to say at the collusion level, it wasn't up to the president, but it happened prior?
I think discussion with Russia is made more difficult because politics has entered into it on our side.
But if that were true, would that worry you?
Well, yes, it worries me because there used to be rational, reasonable minds in Washington who wanted to do everything we could to control nuclear arms. Ronald Reagan was one of those.
No, I'm talking about lower-level campaign officials talking to the Russians, if that is true, just not the president.
Yeah, I don't know what that would have to do with whether or not we would have diplomatic relations with the Russians.
No,
and it shouldn't.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. That alone, these latest developments and revelations, if true, does it change the whole perspective on this investigation?
You know, I'm never really sure of what people are talking about. The other day there was a story saying Manafort gave polling data to the Russians, and it's like, well, you can look online, you know, and get polling data. Polling data is out there everywhere. Polling data is a dime a dozen. So to say that and to say, oh no, low-level, campaign officials in the Trump campaign gave polling data, it's like, and? So really we have to think about, what we're talking about here. Are we talking about espionage? Are we talking about people trading, being traitors to their country? That's a big deal.
Whatever that report is, and let's say Mr. Barr becomes the next Attorney General, would you be for him releasing all this information, getting it all out there?
I've been against the idea of a special prosecutor completely. I don't like it at all. Right. I think what they did to General Flynn was scandalous and inappropriate, and really every American is in danger of that. So I'm not big on the report, period. I don't think the investigation should have proceeded this way at all.
Senator, thank you very much. I did want to talk. I know you're having some surgery done in Canada. You're paying cash for it. I wish you well, feel well, get better. All right, Rand Paul.